Okay, everybody, we have reached the bottom of the hour, so let's get started with today's L10 webinar. No tricks, just tips. Surviving 2025 policy changes, sponsored by CMR Institute. Happy Halloween, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's program. My name is Tim Sosby. I'm editorial director for L10. It's my pleasure to welcome you today and serve as the host of our program. And I'm going to start with some quick housekeeping tips, and then I'm going to get out of the way and let the speakers take it from there. We are planning a 60-minute session for you today. You'll notice that your phones are on mute, but we'd love to hear from you. Any questions, any comments, please do enter them into the chat window. You can also use the Q&A window or the chat window, but we'd love to hear from you throughout today's webinar. We're going to try to make this a very interactive program, so if you have something to say, rush to the chat window and let us hear it. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand on the L10 website. I'm going to share an address with you later for that recording. I'm also going to send you a follow-up email tomorrow with a link to the recording as well. So either through that email or through the L10 website, you'll be able to access today's recording, and certainly feel free to share with your friends. And speaking of sharing, as you leave today, a follow-up survey will pop up on a separate browser window. When you leave today, please do look for that survey and quickly share your thoughts with us. We always appreciate your feedback. And along those lines, there is an email address where you can reach me. I'll share that later in today's program as well. If I can help with anything around our webinars or L10 membership, certainly don't hesitate to reach out. All righty, with all of that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to our speakers today. I'm going to turn things over to Sharon Lustig. Sharon's the CEO and president of CMR Institute, and she's going to tell you about today's program and take it from here. Sharon, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you to all of our attendees. Happy Halloween, everybody. Today's discussion, No Tricks, Just Tips, Surviving 2025 Policy Changes, will focus on 3 key outcomes for you today. My advancer's not working. Hang on just one second. There we go. We'll try that. 3 key issues today. So we'll provide some high-level insights from our article, What's on the Line for Life Science Learning and Development in 2025. And we'll provide some, Tim, did you do that? I didn't do that. Sorry, guys.
Sorry about that. That was me. Sorry.
Okay, that's okay. That's okay.
Ghost in the machine. Let's call it that.
So we'll provide some tips for how to move forward for your internal customers and your peers. 2Connect has joined with CMR Institute to share some real-world and practical strategies for communicating complex policy shifts to ensure your teams are competitive in the marketplace. And then we're going to wrap with some great takeaways and tips for being a leader in this shifting environment of ours and to stay on top of what your teams really need to know. There will be 2 takeaways that we'll share in the chat today, as Tim mentioned, and as we move through our discussion, 2Connect will have a great resource for you, and CMR Institute will upload our articles. So watch for those downloadable resources a little further into the hour. And just as a reminder, both 2Connect and CMR Institute are really here for further conversation. We can't do it all in 55 minutes. So if this is an area you're passionate about and need some consultation or assistance with, please reach out. Our contact information will be shared shortly. So let's move through into our next slide. So we'd like to ask you to, as you think about your customers in healthcare, what do you think this 1.4 million number represents? Let's get your opinion and type in the chat your best guess. What does 1.4 million mean or is about your customers? And I very much hope that that's not the leftover candy or the candy that you get from your children this evening. 1.4 million candy bars. Any guesses?
It looks like Mark said meetings that they host. Current U.S. college students. That's a good one, Ray.
Reps.
Reps.
Hours and meetings. Oh, there's a really good one. Yeah. So healthcare decision makers today get interrupted every day, just like you do. And among those seeking attention are really, they're members of our own sales teams in one form or another. These customers are receiving on average 1.4 million touch points every working hour from life sciences manufacturers. So that's what the 1.4 stands for. So sales roles and commercial models and communication platforms have and are changing a lot. But what hasn't changed is the need to ensure that those carrying your message have and use the most up-to-date information available. What hasn't changed is also the need to build capabilities that encourage a two-way exchange of information and data that builds real value within the customer for your organization. The skills and the knowledge those various roles and the teams need are evolving as commercial models are shifting and as the industry is learning how to make the most of the touch points that they do have. How do we ensure that this time is provided and is well used and that the conversation brings real value? That's what we're going to be concentrating on for the next few minutes, a few areas that are changing in our immediate landscape and why you will want to be aware of them and how you can cascade this information through to your teams to support your organization's goals. And before we get too much further, as I hit the wrong button, I'd like to introduce our co-presenting team here for our time together and share a quick treat rather than a long bio, a fun fact about each of us. So I'd like to welcome Diane and Mark. Diane, would you like to get started? You're on mute, dear.
Really pleased to be here. And a fun fact that I'll share with everybody. I don't know the kind of the generation that is on this call, but years ago, my brother and I were almost on The Gong Show, which is a very kind of campy, stripped down version of America's Got Talent.
That's great. That's really great. I have to hear more about that later. Mark?
Thank you for everybody for joining us today. Mine has nothing to do with generational. It has to do with youth and stupidity. When I was younger, much younger, I actually hitchhiked on an airport runway and got a ride in an airplane.
Wow.
I think you win. I think you win, Mark. A fun fact about me is that on my honeymoon more years ago than I really care to admit, I met Bill Murray and Harold Ramis and their families at a B&B right after our wedding. It's kind of a long and funny story, but they were really, really nice. So thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing. I want to remind everyone, as Tim mentioned, about the Q&A box. It will be available throughout, and we'll have team members answering questions, and we'll try to get to all of them. And if we can't, we will definitely follow up at the end. As noted here, we'll have time for Q&A toward the end of our time together to kind of wrap up and get more questions. So let's talk about market landscape changes, beginning with either the elephant or the donkey in the room, depending upon. Many experts believe that since both candidates have history in the White House, that the election really holds fewer surprises for life sciences than other elections. Surprises, not necessarily changes. So depending upon what analyst you listen to, even the impact of the election on life sciences may be felt as much at the state level in the next year as at the federal level. To help us center us on the change overall, let's overview just a few changes that are either known or expected to impact 25 and look at how these could impact L&D. So let's start with drug price negotiations. Through the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act of 22, government regulation around drug price changes will continue in 25. Certainly, legal discussions will continue around this act. There have been changes introduced for the second cycle coming in 25 that will be a bit different than this past year. But for us in L&D, the shift means continuing to prepare various roles and various levels to understand not only the new regulatory framework, but also how to communicate about those changes with their stakeholders. And again, as policies evolve, and again, where these shifts land, Medicare, Medicaid, state level restrictions on coverage could tighten, and it could make it harder for patients to access certain medications. This will affect how our teams engage with healthcare providers and other decision makers. We'll need to train them on discussing changes to policy clearly and empathetically, ensuring that they can help navigate these shifts to best support their patients as the policy shifts become more clear. Another big area, obviously, is Medicare Part D. Certainly, there's probably no one on our call today that isn't aware that CMS has removed the coverage gap and replaced it with 3 Part D prescription drug stages, lowered out-of-pocket maximums for Part D prescription drugs, and provided a new prescription payment plan option. These changes may in fact lower prescription drug expenses, but they might result in higher deductibles or premiums in 25, which could impact enrollment coverage. In L&D, we can really anticipate a need for our teams to better understand Medicare's evolving framework. Offering accurate information to our stakeholders will be just increasingly important as the January deadline comes at us. Again, looking at another area around curbing rising drug costs, the 340B program will likely be impacted. How? We don't know yet. Likely there will be changes in eligibility and maybe discount structures. So hospitals that serve certain populations may be impacted. That means that we need to educate our teams on the nuances of the 340B landscape where it is now, to ensure that they can effectively support the healthcare providers who may face unique financial and operational challenges as things do change. And lastly, let's talk lightly about prior authorizations. Certainly, there's a lot of concern from providers regarding prior authorizations causing delayed care and increased costs through additional office visits. Some movement on prior authorization simplification was made in January. And in June, both sides of the aisle introduced updated legislation that actually failed last year. This one will move to streamline prior authorization in Medicare Advantage plans. So we'll need to keep an eye on those bills to understand the workflows and how we can support our customers. There are so many more possibilities than we have time to discuss here, but I think we can all agree that just these are impactful to our customers' business and to access for care for their patients, access to drugs for their patients. Impact on learning and development as these changes occur is really important to realize. So what's on the line for L&D as we move forward? And failing to implement training against these ever-changing landscape changes that are facing us. Failing to quickly update our learning content and to ensure learning transfer and application of that content could really lead to learning gaps that put your team at a disadvantage with your competitors and in the market in front of their customers. It's possible that a lack of preparation and communication could weaken a data-driven case that your product demonstrates enough value to justify its price. It's also very difficult to maintain an agile market access strategy as things are shifting if the team is not well informed or practiced in their ability to communicate complex changes within the context of your business and the business of their customers. So given that, what can we do now in light of upcoming changes, some of which are frankly unknown? Mark is going to spend some time talking further about this deeper into our presentation. So I will say a couple of facts. Review your market access content for customer-facing and non-customer-facing roles for potential gaps in the basics, and start looking for help identifying resources to close them as more information is known. You should look to update and refresh certain areas of your evidence-based selling content, your HEOR content. Collaborate with your market access team to identify common needs for potential learning resources. Ensure that everyone is level set so the updates as they roll in can be absorbed quickly. Policy and changing regulation training is really only part of the equation. For life sciences teams to be truly successful in 25, it's really essential that they refine their soft, or what we often call power skills. So let's take a moment to consider some of these. Customer engagement skills are really more important than ever. As different roles discuss policy changes, they'll really need to convey complex information clearly while building trust and building empathy. In the absence of these skills, conversations may become transactional rather than relational, which really risks valuable connections. Additionally, with companies investing heavily in omni-channel marketing, teams must know how to leverage those tools effectively. Omni-channel isn't just about having multiple communication channels. It's really about using the right channel at the right time and tailoring those messages based on the insights that they gather from those tools. Team members who can integrate these insights into their customer interactions will be able to reach the decision maker with precision. Without this, they could miss critical opportunities or fail to optimize the substantial investment that you have made in all of these tools. And lastly, let's not overlook the importance of team skills and other role-based competencies. Policy shifts create new and sometimes unfamiliar territory, but they also create a lot of opportunity to have new conversations with their team members and with their customers. Teams that collaborate well and share insights and support each other will navigate the changes with much more agility. They'll also be better equipped to handle objections and handle those complex questions and be able to align solutions with their customers. In contrast, I think we can all agree that a lack of team cohesion could lead to misinformation or poor messaging, which often erodes trust either at the team level or at the customer level. So what's on the line for L&D? There's no surprise that many of us here have what's on the line for learning and development if teams are not prepared, if they're not engaging with the right people, if they're not meeting goals, if they're missing opportunities to move further up the chain of decision makers and not utilizing all of the tools well that they have at their disposal. That will lead to impacts in the marketplace. But there are things that we can do now, regardless of the policy climate. We can consider taking time to refresh our content with a focus on power skills with your teams. We can reinforce the importance of using emotional intelligence and selling with empathy. We can continue to offer updated learning and content on value-based selling strategies, which are crucial to building long-term partnerships with customers. So Mark, let's talk for a couple of seconds about what happens if we don't get this right. You spoke to me a little bit earlier about a really great example. Would you take a minute to share that with us?
Absolutely. Thanks, Sharon. We're in a meeting just recently, in fact, with a hospital administrator, IDN senior executive, and he was expressing his, how shall we say it, displeasure with the pharma industry who called on him. He was at a dinner which was no doubt a fancy steakhouse, where him and clinical stakeholders were talking about a specific device that they wanted to have, and they're trying to push that on to the customer here. And what happened was, as he said to us, they did not understand who was the decision maker. It was me. And I had already made the decision because they didn't understand how I was reimbursed through CMS on this particular project. And they could talk all they wanted to, but they weren't going to do that because they didn't provide me value, because they did not communicate and know how the reimbursement impacted my job and how I could do my job. So it was very eye-opening, and it was very forceful, if I remember correctly.
And where does that leave us, right? Loss of credibility, loss of access, probably the missed opportunity to ever get in front of him again. At least that was his opinion. And, you know, the ineffective value proposition and of the long-term impacts of this person's opportunity, whether it be a device or a drug that they were walking through. Thank you, Mark.
Absolutely.
Let's talk a few minutes in the chat from our attendees. What other impacts could you foresee if your team's not updated with this information? The chat for us. Mark, there was another funny kind of story that you shared with me earlier about, I can't remember which one it was You want to share one other example real quick?
I'll share another example. Here, here's what this has a lot of impacts on a lot of different parts of what we do. But the one thing that we have in leadership and development, or not leadership, learning and development, is this, right? If something goes wrong, whose fault is it? It's our fault. It's always learning and development's fault. And so literally, if we're not ahead of the game on this and trying to be proactive, guess what? It comes down on us, and it hurts our reputation internally within our organizations, large or small. So that's a huge one. And I guess one more would be our original consumers, of whether they're account managers or representatives or MSLs, their morale goes down because they don't feel properly armed to be able to go out and deal with the customers that they deal with on a daily basis. So those are some huge some implications other than just what happens in front of the customer.
Yeah. And Greg, I see your comment that, you embarrass yourself in front of your customers and bring, miss opportunities to bring value. And, clearly there are a lot of implications if we don't get this right. And from maybe a communication lens that I'll bring to the conversation, I think all of this gets amplified because so much of this complex information that's so important that you need to communicate to your stakeholders, they then need to turn around and communicate it to their stakeholders. And so it's really easy in these situations to have one big game of telephone with a, let's just call it, less than desirable outcome. And to illustrate how this telephone game can happen in organizations, I want to share with you a communication experience that we had with a participant in one of our small group training programs. He was getting ready to present to a group of leaders on laptop security, right? Compelling topic. And his hope was that they would cascade this information to their teams. So as I share this example, I want to put you in the audience, just as L&D leaders as you are, and think about if your job was to cascade this information, how successful would you be? So he started by saying, hey, everybody, thanks for being here. We're going to talk about laptop security, something that is very important to our organization. Then he proceeded to talk about the evolution of laptop security and all the advancements that there had been to find ways to make our laptops more secure. But then he said, despite that, there's still a lot of vulnerabilities in our laptops. And then he went through and he started to list out what all the vulnerabilities were in our laptops, how people might be able to hack our computers. He then talked about what the organization was doing to protect our laptops and listed out all these things. And then at the very end, he talked about what employees need to be doing to add that extra layer of security on their laptops. So let me put you in that audience. You're a leader. You need to cascade this. How successful do you think you'd be based on that communication? So put yourself in the audience. You need to cascade this. How successful do you think you'd be in cascading that information? And Mark and Sharon, you can certainly chime in if you want. Mark, 0. Greg, I would leave with many doubts, right? Not successful. Yeah, there's going to be a lot at stake here. I'm not sure what the important information is. Not good. Yeah, so clearly we're not setting up anybody for success to cascade this complex information. Well, good news is this participant was in a program where they get to practice, they get video recorded, they get feedback, and then they get to re-deliver that presentation, incorporating that feedback. So I'm going to give you a gist of what he did on round 2, and I think you're going to find it's better. So what I'd love for you to be thinking about and chat and putting in chat is kind of what was different. What did he do differently that made it more impactful? So he started by asking a question. He said, how would you feel if we found out that our organization's competitors were reading our emails and your laptop was the breach? Not good, I'm guessing. So the headline message I want to leave with all of you is that laptop security is everyone's responsibility. It's not just IT, it's just not managers, it's everybody. So I'm going to share 3 things that as employees, you all need to be doing moving forward to make sure that your laptop doesn't become that security breach in the future. And then he went on to explain the 3 things employees need to do. So give me a sense, what did he do differently to make that more impactful? I think before we said may not know what information to share. Ron, we got him thinking in this case. Just a question does that? Absolutely. What else did you see that was different and made it a little bit more impactful? Yeah, Elena, tied in relevance, right? He did a good job of really thinking about what the audience might care about, which is critical. Anything else popping up when you think about what he did differently?
The things we say here is clarity is kindness.
Clarity is kindness. So he added some clarity to that communication. Absolutely. From our standpoint, the first go around, he just threw out kind of everything he knew and basically was leaving it to you to figure out what's important, what you might cascade in the organization. And I think we all know as leaders, we don't have time to do that. And probably if I make that choice, I may not make the right choice on what I cascade. In the second go around, he took a little time to think about who his audience was, and he looked at his content, and then he really pulled out that relevant story out of all of that data that was going to have an impact on that audience. And I think, Laura, I see you said you really tied the problem to the attendees. He pulled out that relevant story for his audience. He did that work. And when he did that, he made it a lot more compelling, a lot more memorable, and much easier to cascade. So how can you do this with the communications that you're doing day in and day out, including these complex policy changes that are on the horizon? Well, there's a lot of things we can do, but we're going to pull out just 3 tips that we can borrow from storytelling to do that work to pull out the story out of all of our data. And to make this real world for you, what I encourage you to do is think about an upcoming communication that you have. It could be related to some of these policy changes. It could be something else. What's most important is that it feels timely and real for you. And then use the handout that we just dropped in chat to capture notes and think about how you might apply these tips to your upcoming communication. And this is a handout that you can use for this exercise as well as any future communications that you do. So before I go into the tips, just a quick warning. As we talk about these tips, you may find yourself saying, yeah, I know that, right? If you do, I want to challenge you to ask yourself this question. Did you do it in your last communication? Because here's what we find. We find that really good communicators know this, but great communicators do it, and they do it consistently. So we're going to talk about 3 tips, kind of the bottom line message around how do we kind of pull that story from the data. And really that's our responsibility as a communicator. So let's talk about 3 different ways we can do that. One is that we want to make our content relevant. And this is a hallmark of storytelling. And if we think about the example that I shared in the first go round, he just kind of took his knowledge, shared it with his audience with very little regard to who his audience was. Second time, he really thought about his audience, and we got him thinking about things like what's important to them right now. How can you tie your topic to what's really going to be top of mind for them? And then thinking about content to share, we got them thinking about, well, given their role, what do they need to really know? And probably more importantly, what do they not need to know? And so going through that exercise with him, he was able to do a couple of things. One is kind of, Elena, I saw you say this, and I think, Mark, you may have too, is he was able to really make his content relevant by tying his topic to what he identified was going to be most important to his audience. And that is that no employee wants their laptop to be the security breach. And then 2 is he was able to get rid of a whole bunch of content including the evolution of laptop security, that he realized, even though he knew it, it probably wasn't going to be relevant to his audience. So as you think about these complex changes on the horizon, it's so important to take that pause and think about your different audiences, whether they're reimbursement managers, whether they're sales leaders, they're sales reps. It's really tying them. Yep, Elena, for what you said, it's really tying it. They're saying, what's in it for me? And we can only do that if we take that minute to think about our audience and be able to make some of those connections. The next tip that helps us to pull the story out of our data is to know your bottom line message. And this is a hallmark from storytelling that we can borrow. You know, if we think about, for those of us who grew up in the United States, many of us were told this story, the tortoise and the hare. And my guess is it's been a hot minute since anybody has read you this story. But after all these years, you know, what still comes to mind when you think about this story, the tortoise and the hare? Slow and steady wins the race. So that is the power of a really clear bottom line message. And in the case of the presenter, his bottom line message was, hey, folks, bottom line, laptop security is everybody's responsibility. So if we want our audiences to get a clear message, we need to share that with them. And if we want them to repeat it, we need to make sure that is easy, clear, and repeatable. So let me give you a couple of examples of this. Let's imagine that you are presenting to a group of sales leaders, and you've analyzed your audience a little bit. So you've uncovered that they already know, and maybe this is going to be on Medicare Part D in 2025. And you've identified that, you know, they already know that there's changes on the horizon, and they already know the importance of keeping their team up to speed. So you've determined that really what I need to talk about is how we get them up to speed. And so an example of a core message there, and this is a shameless plug for CMR, but it could be, you know, bottom line leaders, we recommend leveraging CMR's library to quickly provide the field with foundational knowledge, and then we can do follow-on sessions to reinforce. That could be a bottom line message, and then the rest of what you talk about really supports this recommendation. Another quick example, imagine that the sales force is starting to hear about these targeted therapies from their competitors, and you can kind of sense that they're not quite understanding this whole personalized medicine space and how it's going to impact their role in 2025. So in communicating with them, a potential core message could be, look, folks, the headline from all of these advancements in personalized medicine is that it requires continued expansion of your science knowledge and understanding of treatment pathways. So it's getting to the essence of your message. Now, this isn't easy to do. We're basically saying take everything you could talk about and get it down to a central message. And one thing that can help us is using sentence stems. And sentence stems do a couple things. One is they help us start to get clear on what our bottom line message might be. And they also provide a compelling way for us to communicate that message to our audience. So we've included a couple of examples in your handout that are here on the screen, you know, saying things like, you know, out of all of this change, team, the headline is. Just saying that starts getting us thinking about what that bottom line message is, and then it makes it, it provides a compelling way to communicate it to your audience. So think about that bottom line message. It's so important when we need to communicate complex information, and even more important when that needs to be cascaded. The last tip that we can borrow from storytelling that helps us to really pull the story out of our data and make our content really palatable for our audience is to provide a simple agenda. And I absolutely know this idea of a simple agenda is not new to anybody on this call. I think that the thing to amplify here is the simple. And quick example, if we were to, so imagine you step into a meeting and presenter starts speaking and you see this next slide. I want you to put in chat just instantly what comes to mind. So you're in a meeting, presenter starts to talk, and they show this slide. And oh, by the way, this is something you're going to need to cascade. All right. Too much text. Yep. Well, and Mark, word salad, absolutely. Too much to absorb. And so from the beginning, we're getting people thinking this is hard, which isn't what we want to do with our audience. So we can't, Greg Junior Varsity, thank you for that commentary. So if we can just simplify our agenda, it's going to make it so much more palatable and potentially easier to cascade if that message needs to go further in the organization. And I just want to call out here, this idea of simplicity doesn't mean that I'm leaving out any important information. It just means I'm doing the work to make this message a lot more palatable and easy for our audience to take in. Okay. So there you have it. No tricks, just 3 tips on what we can do to pull the story from our data. And in the context of this conversation, it becomes that much more important because the information you are communicating is complex. And so often that information needs to get cascaded even further beyond your direct audience. So if we can leverage these tips, it helps us to provide that clarity that our audiences need. So I encourage you to pull out that handout, use it for future communications, and make sure you're always saying, yes, I did it in my last communication. All right, so we've spent a little bit of time talking about what's on the horizon and what's at stake for L&D. Talked a little bit about communication tips to cascade that. The last point that we thought would be helpful to spend some time on is, given all these changes that isn't unique to this year, there's always changes. From an L&D perspective, how do we take on that leadership role in our organization with regard to these changes? And we have Mark here to share his real life insights because he's had real life experience in a lot of L&D organizations. So I'm really pleased to pass the conversation off to Mark. Mark, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Oh, thank you. I apologize for that. Thanks, Diane. I appreciate that. Let me, Diane, follow the coaching that you just gave it all and start with a little story, first of all. When I first came into a learning and development role, I sat down with my new boss and she told me this: you don't want to be an order taker, you want to be a strategic partner. And that sounded just absolutely wonderful. Oh, that's great. And that's going to be the easiest thing in the world to do because I'll just provide value. And very quickly, everything sort of evolved or devolved into what? I was taking orders for eggs and bacon and coffee and things like that. I literally became an order taker. But it's important for us to begin to think about leading from whatever seat you're in, whether you're leading an L&D team or whether you're on an L&D team. You lead from the seat that you sit in, and you can move forward to do that. So just a couple of things here and some practical steps. We'll go to the next slide, Sharon, to think about. It all starts clearly with preparation. And one of the lessons I had to learn was, let's not prep for a single meeting. We have to do that. Obviously, you have to do that. But begin to prep for a relationship that you want to have with a key stakeholder. So that's long-term preparation over time. So preparation is at the heart of everything that you do. And I know that I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but shift your mind a little bit around. I'm just going to prepare for the meeting I have next Monday with the VP of the franchise head of the oncology franchise. That's great. We should be doing that all the time, and I'm sure all of you do that. But begin to think, how have I prepared before the meeting from a relational perspective with that? So let's go to the first one. Proactivity absolutely rules. If you let yourself be the order taker, you're being reactive and not proactive. And so I'd encourage you, think about how you are going to identify issues and raise those things before they're raised to you. Think about that. Second thing is, read what your stakeholders are reading. I mean, simple questions to ask them. where do you go for your strategy? What are you interested in? What do you read outside from a business perspective and how it might impact you on a day-to-day basis? And then go read what they're reading. Get deep in the weeds of what they're doing and what's interesting to them. And it goes back to what Diane was just saying. Find out what's relevant to them and move forward with that. Third is, if you don't have a relationship with your competitive intelligence, number 3, and your government affairs, and access to those executive summaries that go out monthly, quarterly, whatever they do, figure out a way to get involved and get that into your system. Sometimes it may mean you have to ask the stakeholder for them or ask the author for them, or I'm an old sales guy, so I always would ask, somebody like a receptionist who sent it out, could you send it to me? Could you add it to me? So nobody had a chance to tell me no, and they were doing me a favor and they wanted to help me. So by reading that in the competitive intelligence and the government affairs, you have an understanding of what's coming up from a policy perspective and on the horizon. It may or may not happen, but it goes back to number 1. It allows you to be proactive and understand what everybody else is reading. Next, I don't want anybody to be Inspector Clouseau here or Columbo or anything like that, but I've worked in large organizations and small organizations. You have to be a detective within that organization to find out in smaller organizations who has and doing this competitive intelligence type of work, who is doing this government affairs type of work. Marketing will probably be doing it. Medical affairs will probably be doing some of that. Your access teams will be doing some of this. You've got to go to different places if you go from a large company to a small company, because it's not as apparent where this is going to be coming from. Next, and I think this goes to foundational, what we want you to think about is understand where you are today. Unless you are building a brand new sales force or you're in a startup with a new sales force coming in, nobody on your teams is level set on the vast majority of the information. They have no knowledge, or they have varying levels of degree. So let's take, for example, if there's potential 340B policy changes that may occur, where is your organization in relation to 340B? You might have to go to your LMS. You may have to find out who's taking the courses on that. You may actually have to inform them on what is actually happening today before you can begin to do the training on tomorrow. Very important. And last, and this goes again to what Diana said, a standing agenda item. I love Diane's 3 quick bullet points that she talked about there, but under there, what I did with all of my key stakeholders, whether it was marketing, whether it was sales, whether it was franchise leads, whether it was access leads, is I always had something around policy updates or things, I call it this, things that kept them up at night in the future. If this happens, I will have sleepless nights. That is exactly what you need to do. So hopefully when you begin to look at this, again, with preparation at the heart and some of these practical things, you're going to be able to feel like you're no longer, I live in the South, so I'll say it, at the Waffle House taking orders, but now you're a strategic partner with your stakeholders, and the value proposition for your learning and development organization continues to grow. Thank you. Let me just ask everybody real quick a question here. What strategies have you used to inform your team of major shifts in the marketplace? So put that in the chat if you wouldn't mind, just briefly. How have you done this? I'm an N of 1. I've had a great experience in the learning and development role, but I would love to hear what others are doing, if there is anything. I know I saw Scott Sugarman on there, so I know Scott knows has done this a little bit. So I know some of those people out there know exactly what's going on.
I see Ron says frequent communications.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Proactive. Thanks, Greg. Thank you so much. Resource creation workshops, case studies. It's great point, Elena, is having something for them to respond to before you actually present the need is a great tool to be able to pull out of your bag or out of your briefcase or wherever it might be on your iPad to be able to do that moving forward. So that's absolutely fantastic. Anything else? Well, just for example, we do know on the Medicare Part D side, things are actually going to happen as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act. But when you go to the 340B policy shift, we don't know what's going on. We don't know what's going to happen with this. And Sharon, feel free to jump in with this as well. But here's an example. and I said it earlier, in references earlier, where are you? You may not be able to, may not have to generate a training program that just deals with an entire organization, but only a slice of your organization. So understand the impact and where it impacts those audience members that you have, and what's the history of your training of 340B in your organization. It may have been ad hoc, it may have been just personal professional development, but where's everybody, where's the foundation level, and where's everybody lined up to be? And where they are in their understanding of what today's world is. And I referenced this before, tomorrow's world training has to occur after all of those other steps are come across. And then I guess what I would say is this: I can't overestimate or overstate the value of reinforcement of what tomorrow's training is. So understand, is this simply a knowledge transfer, or is it also a knowledge transfer and a behavioral shift and a behavioral transfer that you need to also do as well? And get agreement with your stakeholders, quite frankly, on who is going to help you reinforce this. Because as an L&D professional, you may have one bite at that apple, but to be able to get true reinforcement and learning to happen, you have to have agreement from stakeholders that frontline managers or others in the organization are going to actually help you reinforce the knowledge transfer as well as the behavioral skills moving forward. So lots of things. If you look up today, after you get off of the webinar, 340B policy shifts, there's tremendous things that could potentially happen that could change what's going on in our business, in our world. So without that, let me just transfer this back to Sharon, and she's got a little bit of closing here to do for us today. And I want to thank you again for attending.
Thanks, Mark. So back to this $1.4 million interactions every hour that healthcare receives from life sciences. You know, if even a fraction of those can become more productive, provide more value, builds credibility for your team, for the organization, you've really made a positive impact, and you've led through great change in 2025. Today, we shared some policy shifts in our white paper. There are more listed that we didn't go into today. There may be certainly changes that are coming that are not even listed in the most wonderful pundits out there. But the important things that we can do today are to ensure that we have provided good foundational material, good updated and relevant information that our teams need to grow credibility and value to their customers. Do that background work that Mark spoke to, use the tips that Diane has shared with you today. Together, CMR Institute and 2Connect really makes a great team, bringing relevant information together, up-to-date information, timely information, as well as solid methods for communication, for application, for pull-through. I know there's some questions coming across here. I'm trying to look at a couple of different screens. I apologize. But let me just say that we're very thrilled that you could join us today. We'll head into some question time. I think we've got a few minutes. And let's see. I see one here.
Yeah,
I'm sorry,
I'll chime
Diane.
in just as a moderator, Sharon. I think the general question was, what are the themes? Of course, you have so much content on your website. There's these policy shifts, but are there other things that the speakers are seeing that companies are focusing on for next year as a critical skill or knowledge set?
Mark, do you want to take that first, or do you want me to jump in?
I can jump in, and feel free to jump in as well, Sharon. I think Medicare Part D changes are a major undertaking right now. I mean, they want to understand how, when you take the donut hole away, what's the impact on that? What's the impact on how we communicate that? How does that change potential marketing messages and things along those lines? That's a huge piece. And I think it can, one that's probably not going to surprise you. We talked briefly about it, but again, there is worry around 340B pricing and how a 340B policy that may happen. Nothing is firm, but there's just a recent lawsuit that was settled where essentially pharma, our industry had reached out and said, hey, we don't want to have contract pharmacies. Now that the lawsuit was settled and 340B said, no, you can't limit those. Well, now pharma won that one. There's also potential changes in 340B around how the application, and they're very interested around this, how the application of the 340B pricing occurs. Right now, it usually, the history is it's done at the point of sale. You order the vial, the invoice comes at the discounted price. There's a shift, and a couple of companies have already done this, and there will be lawsuits and there will be a lot of angst around this. They want to use a rebate method. So you have the hospital has to prove that this actually went to a 340B patient type of a situation. That there's a lot of issues that are with that. How do we deal with that? How do we move forward with that? And then the other thing I think, you know, from a policy perspective, is just, again, all of the compliance that comes around this. How do you communicate these policy changes in a compliant way, and a way that doesn't take away from your primary message?
I'd say in addition to policies and the shifts that we're seeing in, like you said, compliance, et cetera, I've seen it just in the last 3 or 4 months, a lot of questions about how to expand the knowledge and capability for conversation and help at the patient access level, the field reimbursement managers. We're doing an awful lot of work around content to really bulk their abilities and capabilities and conversation points. And so that, not necessarily a shift for 25, but I think it's even more moving more quickly, let's say that. So that would be an area that a lot of our customers are talking about, in addition to the policy shifts, most definitely new roles in the market as things change on those teams and the commercial models are shifting. And I'd have to reinforce too that just as important as some of the content that we've talked about in terms of the policies and the marketplace and the landscape is that the emotional intelligence, the resilience in the marketplace, and really looking at To Connect and Diane and sharing those 3 tips for how to really clarify that message, because you only get a few minutes. And when you lose those few minutes by not getting to the point or sharing the point that your customer really wants you to share, it can really disable you for the next opportunity to get in front of a higher end decision maker in that same place. And I know all of us can share stories about that. Mark and I were sharing stories before we got on the call about that today. So those are a few that we would share. Yes.
Yeah, and I'll jump in. I think, Sharon, to your point, I think that I don't know if we've seen drastic changes, but just the amplification around the need of, and Mark, I like how you said it, you know, of course we need to be compliant, but we also need to be clear in what we're communicating. And I think what we've seen over the last couple of years is, and this ties into the omni-channel marketing, is that there are so many different communication channels that we're communicating through, and we need to be clear on all of those. So internally, thinking about emails, one-on-one conversations, as well as one-on-one conversations with our customers in the field, all of those are opportunities to look at our communication and make it clear and specific for our audience. And it gets harder and harder as things get more complex and more information is coming our way.
It does. It absolutely does. Thank you. So again, Diane and Mark and I, we really thank you for being with us today. We encourage you to download the resources that we've shared, and we really invite conversation to go beyond this. If you need consultation and help, I think that either of us would be happy to entertain a conversation separately or together. So we appreciate your time today, and I'll hand it back over to Tim.
Sharon, thank you very much. And let me thank you and Diane and Mark. Great job, everybody. We appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you.
Folks,
right.
just as we're wrapping up here, thank you all. Folks, just as we're wrapping up today, I wanted to end with a couple of invitations. One, I wanted to remind you to get involved with LTEN. We always love to have members get involved. You can volunteer, you can share, you can write for our magazines, speak on webinars. Just use LTEN to find your partners and your network connections. Visit l-10.org. It's a good place to get started and a good place to bookmark and see where it takes you from there. And speaking of where it takes you, I'm going to invite you all to join us next Tuesday. We'll be back for our next webinar talking about stories, visuals, and data, unlocking the power of storytelling in life sciences. You can see some other programs coming up as well. You can find more information and register for all these at l-10.org/webinars. You can also access on-demand webinars through that address, and today's recording will be up there within the hour. So feel free to look at the website for the recording. Again, we're going to send you a follow-up email tomorrow as well. And if you have any questions or anything we can help with, here's an email address you can reach out to reach us, webinars@l-10.org. With all that said, I'm going to send a final thank you to our speakers today, Sharon Lustig, Diane West, and Mark Jarvis. I'm going to thank our sponsors again, CMR Institute, and I'm going to thank all of you for spending a bit of a Halloween with us today. We appreciate your time, attention, and lots of participation in today's webinar. Thank you all for that. Everybody have a good rest of your day. Enjoy your Halloween with your kids and your family and friends. We will see you all soon. Enjoy the rest of your week too. Have a great weekend, and we will talk to you all soon, everybody. Bye-bye.
All right, take care. Trick or treat. Happy Halloween.